Okay. All right. Sorry, the debate screwed up last time, so it's resolution nations should always respect the absolute sovereignty of other nations when assessing intervention. Okay, so what this debate is about. Sorry, Liam, you have to hear all this again. The first, what this debate is about. There are many instances where states intervene on behalf of other states. Some of them are easy cases where there are genocides happening and the state is welcoming intervention, saying, please, please save us. There are also difficult cases where there are there are other easy cases where there's nothing really going wrong, but states are requiring foreign aid anyway. And then there are very hard cases where there are atrocities occurring on the ground, but the government does not want intervention. What I'm advocating for is that in all of those cases, including the hard ones, that if you're a big, powerful nation like a Western nation like the USA, even when there are atrocities happening in other countries, if the government does not want you there, you should not be there. But this is, of course, the exception is, of course, if they are welcoming and saying we want help, then obviously you should intervene. That is the principle of absolute sovereignty. There are three reasons to which I think this is true. Basically, the overarching theme of my case is the following. When you intervene into another state without their permission, you're presuming that you're going to make things better. It is my contention that interventions are so complicated and that every crisis has its own unique characteristics and all of the long-term outcomes are sufficiently different that, first of all, it's impossible for countries to ever know if they are going to improve things. So often things get much worse. Think to the way in which the US intervention in Iraq led to the power vacuum that created ISIS, something which was very difficult to foresee. The second contention I'm going to bring out is that when you introduce conditions, right, to say, well, under these conditions, we will intervene, because each different international crisis is different and has its own unique characteristics, like not all genocides look exactly the same before they turn into one, it means that the conditions have to be quite vague, or it's not as easy as ticking a bunch of boxes, which means that it allows political actors to manipulate the conditions for their own gain. So intervening for political reasons or intervening for economic reasons, which often leads to bad interventions. The third reason is that when you allow interventions to happen, and when this becomes a regular thing, that states know about it. They know that people will be that they can get intervened if certain conditions happen, and so they act on that knowledge by doing things like trying to get nuclear weapons, by trying to hide the atrocities in their own countries from even their own citizens and from the media, because they fear that if they meet the conditions that they will be intervened on, which leads to worse circumstances for everyone. So with that, I'll pass the mic.
All right, cool. So I'm going to start with some just assessing the burdens here. As you noted, this is an exceptionally high burden for the pro. That is to say that you have to always defending absolute sovereignty, that states should never invade. So for me to win this debate, all I have to demonstrate is at least one category of scenarios in which you would invade or would intervene in some other way. I've got a couple of those categories. I'm going to present two main categories of when I think that a country should be invading, but before that, I'll just do some responses to your arguments. The first argument you make is to say that even when the intentions are good, they don't know the outcome and therefore shouldn't invade. A couple of responses. One, that is something that's true of all actions that a government takes. Even if they have good intentions, they don't know the direct outcomes of those things because lots of things are complex. Another really complex thing is the economy, yet the government still intervenes in those things as well. What I'm pointing out here is just because something is complex doesn't mean they shouldn't engage. The second thing you tell me is that, you're okay for you're okay for interventions to happen if the country is asking for it. Again, if a country asks for it, that doesn't mean the situation's any less complex. You still don't know what's going to happen. So yes, you are defending a scenario in which you don't know what is going to happen, which means that argument that you're making applies to both sides and is unpersuasive in this debate. The next reason to believe that, so the reason I have to believe that even if there's good intentions, even if it results in a bad thing, you can still do it, is that a lot of these scenarios are all or nothing. That is to say, even the worst case scenario of you intervening is the same as not intervening at all. A good example of that is potentially a nuclear power that is likely going to bomb the world, as North Korea can insist consistently threats in doing so. And there are lots of other powers that could potentially do that in the future. ISIS, for example, which doesn't care about other human life and wants to establish a global caliphate, would probably just bomb the world anyway. It's all or nothing in those circumstances, which means it's okay to intervene. The next thing you tell me is that, well, sometimes it just goes wrong. You know, for example, Iraq. Like, yes, things have gone wrong in the past. That doesn't mean you can't learn from them. For example, we wouldn't leave a bunch of weapons behind in Iraq and not have a non-war zone for 40 days so that ISIS can form. Like, There's literally no reason to believe why we would have to repeat the mistakes of the past. The next thing you tell me is it corrupts decision-making. True of all things in government. You're basically making an argument against government here, not an argument against sovereignty. I'm now going to talk about the two categories, or the first one briefly. The first category is that when there is a potential or existent threat to you, that threat could take the form of physical, that is to say that country is going to invade you, ideological, that is to say, like, for example, like the Cold War and like communism that some countries would like to avoid, and thirdly, if existential, that is circumstances in which there are nuclear weapons on the table. These are circumstances in which a government has the right to preemptively defend itself by intervening in another country if that threat is imminent and is likely to occur in the future. I'll pass the mic.
Alrighty. So I didn't get a huge amount of your case, but I'll just defend mine. I guess the first thing to point out with the burden is that you said there needs to be at least one category. If you prove one category or circumstance where you'd intervene without permission, then you win. I just caveat that I think the category needs to be realistic. So, for example, you can't offer the category of, well, what if we invent the omnipotent supercomputer and the supercomputer says that this is the right decision? So it has to be a realistic category in order for you to win. The second thing is on the fact that this decision is complex. So you say that lots of decisions are complex, so that we shouldn't, therefore this would be a rebuff against all complex decisions. What I would say is that foreign intervention is uniquely complex in some pretty intuitive ways. So the first thing is that when it's your economy, you actually have way more information about your own economy than you do about the domestic circumstances of other countries, about their culture, about the way, and I think the Iraq War is a pretty good example of this, where Americans went in pretty much are thinking to themselves what seemed to be an obvious truth because it was self-evident in their constitution that people really wanted democracy and they really wanted freedom. But it was totally unclear because of the long religious history why democracy wasn't a priority for people on the ground. And so that's the sort of thing which foreign intervention is uniquely complex, because you have a unique set of degree of separation between you and knowing what your actions will do. The second thing as well with the economy is that maybe the government shouldn't interfere in the economy in huge ways, right? Like maybe leaving things to the market is the best decision. And that's saying that the economy is so complex that the government shouldn't do things like huge subsidy programs is a relevant decision-making calculus. I mean, that isn't the debate, but just because the economy is complicated would also work for my argument, just to say that the government should also not do huge economic interventions and leave it to the market. The last thing you were saying on this is that there was like all or nothing, that like a nuclear, what if the North Korea gets nukes? Well, in which case I would say you shouldn't preemptively intervene, because that will likely trigger the nuclear holocaust, right? Whereas if, take, for example, we had this decision already with Russia with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what led to the peace was the American government saying, actually, no, we won't intervene. Until the very, very last minute will we do anything. So really, that supports my argument, because when you preemptively intervene, that's when it triggers people actually releasing the nukes. When they know that no one will intervene against each other, that's when no one has the incentive to fire the nukes. The next thing you said briefly was all decision-making things can be corrupt. That ignores the uniqueness of this scenario, because the categories on why you would invade are so vague, because every circumstance is so different, as opposed to lots of other decisions where it's just this like a rather tick boxy calculus. You need to clarify more on that. The other thing you didn't really respond to was the long-term norm thing, which is another reason why this argument holds up. The only stuff I'll respond to your stuff later.
All right. Okay. So I'll remake my first argument. The first category is that sometimes there are threats to a country and they have the right to defend themselves. So preemptively, they can protect themselves, not just in the case of nuclear deterrence, but also in the case of ideological deterrence, and also in the case of just another country just trying to invade them, or you could preemptively invade that country. Those are circumstances in which a country has the right to defend itself. And importantly, it doesn't matter about the outcome, because the country also has the right to self-defense. So for example, if you're like walking through the street and someone attacks you, you can react in self-defense, even though it may have been better for you to not react in self-defense, because you have that right to protect yourself. In the same way, I think countries also have the right to engage in this circumstance, and that would be violating the sovereignty of another country. The second circumstance would be be something like to alleviate suffering. So that is to say, there are dictatorial regimes that oppress citizens, and I don't mean oppress in the bullshit way that people say it in the West. I mean oppress in the real way, in which people are literally dying. They are subject to curfews and cruel and unusual treatment. These are circumstances in which some countries think they have the obligation to intervene. Obviously, not all countries do, but countries like America think they do, because they think they, as you identified before, have a cultural norm that individuals should be free and should have access to rights. This means they have an obligation to intervene that overrides sovereignty. Importantly, the reason why they should be allowed to do this is that the individuals within that dictatorial regime did not consent to that dictatorship and did not consent to that suffering, and therefore deserve the protection of the other countries. What do you say? You tell me that there is a uniquely complex component of international relations, which means that this is distinct from other circumstances. I want to reiterate some of the responses I made in my last speech. On Iraq, I identified that there were mistakes that were made. That does not mean that those mistakes will be repeated in the future, and often means that you could just learn from those things over time and not do stupid things. I don't have to defend America being super arrogant and super dumb. I have to defend them being able to enter other countries in a circumstance in which they deem fit. And the next thing you say is that there's a degree of separation. Obviously, that's just another level of complexity. You can learn that level of complexity. I'm now going to respond to the last thing I didn't get to respond to in the previous case, which is that long-term norm stuff that countries feel like they don't have to develop those things unless they'll be invaded. I think the precise opposite is true. If there is a norm that if you do shit things to your citizens, or you start amassing an army with expressed intent to bomb other countries, as North Korea does, and North Korea has done in the past, if you start to do that and there's a norm in which people will engage, that's a disincentive for you to do those things. Importantly, it creates a political climate in which countries like America can broker nuclear weapons deals with Iran and to stop those things in the bud, because they have the force of that intervention behind them. You do not have that force of intervention to be persuasive.
So the first thing I'll talk about is Liam's reasons for intervention. The first is ideological deterrence. So let's look at an example of where this has happened in the past, which was Vietnam, right? That we were going to stop the domino effect. Why didn't this work out? The first reason it didn't work out is because you actually don't know if you're going to succeed when you go in, right? Because you often know way less about that other country than you know about your own. So the ideological deterrence point presupposes that you'll be successful in your attempt to deter the ideology, which often never happens. And often it actually makes the ideology even more successful, because before, for example, if you're just acting as a non-invading country, take, for example, Soviet Russia versus the US. Soviet Russia imploded because the non-invading US just showed the quality of life was better. They didn't have to invade Soviet Russia for the USSR to collapse. The USSR collapsed because of just economic reasons and cultural reasons, which is what my side stands for. Compare that to the US versus Vietnam, where the invasion of the US made it look like it is us versus them. See, they are coming for you. The West is evil. Capitalism is evil. So often by invading a country to deter an ideology, you actually give that ideology more fuel and more argument to persuade its people. So intervention makes it worse, which is why you shouldn't do it. The second thing you said is that what if you're attacked and you need to defend yourself? This debate isn't about if you're attacked, then it is relinquished its right to sovereignty. That's pretty intuitive. So this is only about preemptively invading. So that the point is irrelevant. The second thing you talked about was protecting the innocent, and you said that the innocent didn't consent. This is maybe a hard thing to say, but I would really question that. Did the Russians not consent, for example, to being ruled by a dictatorship during the years of the Soviet Union? If you participate in a culture and you protest in behalf of certain leaders, or even if you just have inaction and you don't speak up for yourselves, then you are letting it happen around you. So I would question the degree of culpability of people in these horrible states. I think in many cases they did contribute to the dictatorships which then ruled them. So to say just that they're not culpable, I think is untrue. The next thing you said was that we can learn from our mistakes of Iraq. The thing is we can't, because as I said, every situation is way too different. Iraq was supposed to be us learning from our mistakes about the Rwandan genocide, right? Because we didn't intervene enough. So now we have to. And now, now North Korea is supposedly us learning from Iraq, because if we intervene, things get worse. Technology changes, cultures change, everything is so different that it's impossible to learn. And often, even if we think we're learning, we're actually learning the wrong lessons. And so we make things worse. The last thing was on the norm. And you said you'd rather a counter norm where everyone knows if they act up, they'll be invaded. That can't work because there are too many blurry circumstances where we don't act up for domestic political reasons. For example, as long as North Korea has not been invaded, that norm will never have any integrity. The only norm which has the capability of having integrity is mine, where everyone knows that they will not be invaded unless they invade.
All right. North Korean citizens are brainwashed from birth, are subject to curfews, and are starved daily, which means they do not have the strength or the intellectual capacity or knowledge that uprising is a possibility because they are oppressed. That means that they are 0% culpable. That means that they have zero choice in that circumstance in which they were born into for a dictatorship that was installed long before they were born. 2, North Korea is a country that continually threats other countries, that is, like, for example, South Korea, which is an ally of the United States. They have the option to act in self-defense and preemptively invade. You have 2 options. You know that a country is on the warpath and you know that the country is likely to hurt you in the future. If you do not act, they will come for you. If you do act, Hewitt tells you that sometimes it'll fuck up, which is true. Sometimes it will fuck up. Sometimes it'll also succeed. Importantly, if you do nothing, you lose. You get invaded, you get bombed, or you get your government taken over by a radical ideology that you do not want. We know that there are actors with malicious intent, and we know what they will do in the future. In this circumstance, countries have the right and the ability to override sovereignty in which it exists. Another counterexample is, why would you, in what circumstance could you plausibly define sovereignty? That is to say, ISIS could very easily be defined as a nation. It has a functioning military, it has a functioning government, it has functioning schools and services for the individuals within its area. I mean, go look it up if you don't believe me in the audience. They could readily be defined as a nation, and yet they are hell-bent on destroying the world, and they don't care about any human life that is not a part of their caliphate. So the conclusion you should make then is you should act in self-defense, because even if it fails, it's better than them beating and then killing you anyway. Just respond to this. This is true. Like, North Korea exists and ISIS exists. Just respond to this circumstance.
You could have said all of the same things you said about North Korea about the Soviet Union. Would you have invaded the Soviet Union?
This isn't a debate about whether or not I would have. It's whether or not they should be able to and make that choice. As you identified before, different scenarios are different. Like, therefore, they make different choices. In the same way that, like, ISIS, right, hell-bent on destroying the world is not the same as hell-bent on giving the world communism.
I would dispute that. But also, this is my second point with corrupt decision-making. Those categories you've given me are too vague. They're too complicated. We don't know, right, that North Korea is going to nuke the world. We actually don't. And you could have said this about North. So to be clear, your stance is that we should invade North Korea right now. That's what you're saying?
My stance is not that we should invade North Korea. My point here is that when assessing intervention, which is the motion, absolute sovereignty should not be a consideration.
Okay. So, but the problem is that the things you're considering are way too subjective. So you could have, what you're talking about, like, there's a foreign ideology, that's Vietnam, or we will get attacked if we don't invade first, right? That's Iraq. There are WMDs and we need to go in preemptively. The problem is that for your side to work, it presumes that you actually know with degrees of certainty all of the criteria you are ticking, right? Like that they're going to invade, like they are an ideology which is out to kill us, not just to maintain themselves. And you don't know any of those things. You never, ever do. And what does it mean, for example, when you don't know them, how do those decisions get made? The first thing is that what I said, that it becomes corrupted. Certain politicians domestically will invade for their own domestic political purposes, right? They'll use it to fur up nationalism to win a domestic election, or economic, right? Halliburton needs to get more oil, so you invade for those reasons instead. And what does this, and also, or that sometimes you just can't afford the war. Sometimes that you don't want to lose any more American lives. And that leads to the norm, which I'm talking about, where it looks like America picks and chooses for stupid reasons who they invade or not. Because every time you invade a country preemptively, they think, well, we're not any worse than North Korea, and how come we're the ones getting invaded? Maybe it's, some sort of racism, right? Or maybe it's just because we're not, Western enough, or maybe it's because we don't have nuclear weapons. We should get nuclear weapons. And the fact that your side will always look like America picks and chooses because the situations are too complex, because there are always room for other interests to corrupt the decision-making process, means that nations do stupid things you don't want them to do preemptively, like gather nuclear weapons, like hide their atrocities, like oppress their people so that news never gets out to the West, or that they make corrupt patronage alliances with the West. And that's the reason you've got to defer to my side, because it creates a norm where nations don't fear those things and so don't act stupidly in accordingly.
Judges, we do know that ISIS wants to kill the world. They tell us that in all of their propaganda. That's what they say. Like, what Hewitt is telling you is to just belie reality when we do have information. I am not saying that we should invade in every circumstance. I am not saying that we must invade when under threat. I am saying that absolute sovereignty is not a consideration when you are under threat, or when you perceive that the world could be better. That's the important thing. This motion is not about what America should and should not do in terms of setting norms. It's about what countries should do when assessing interventions in other countries. So when you choose to intervene in a country, the fact that that just happens to be another country should be irrelevant to your calculus. Your calculus should include things like, how is this going to help the citizens of my country? How is this going to help the citizens of that other country if I think I have an intervention, if I think I have an obligation there? So when America decides not to invade some countries and invade other countries because of its own human life, that is okay. They are 100% allowed to do that. I am 100% for standing that the concerns of the domestic country should be in this political calculus. I am not standing for that absolute sovereignty should be in this calculus. Could you please defend the motion about sovereignty itself rather than other things?
Okay, the thing is that the criteria you are introducing is way too vague, and also leads to people acting in ways you do not want them to in order to meet your new criteria. So, for example, if you say, well, America should take into consideration the lives of its soldiers, then that encourages war crimes against those soldiers, because the country knows that, hey, when you gas American soldiers, it means the domestic populace loses an appetite. Or if it's, for example, if America should defend its own citizens, it lets countries know, hey, we just need to create more domestic terrorism, because when the citizens grow war fatigued, then they'll pull out. And that's the problem, that you actually encourage the exact sort of international behavior which neither team wants when you introduce these crazy standards. You should just go for non-intervention. So, for example, when you said, with certainty that ISIS wants to kill the world because they say so in their propaganda, we knew with certainty that Soviet Russia wanted worldwide communism because they said so in their propaganda. Do you think they should have invaded Soviet Russia?
No, as I said before, sovereignty shouldn't be a factor. I'm not defending you have to invade in every circumstance. I'm saying that in every circumstance, sovereignty is not something that you should consider. And really, judges, I want to point out here, Hewitt's bullshitting you when he tells you my criteria are vague. I've told you that they have an intent to attack, as ISIS have told us. Not only have I given you concrete evidence, but this is a real thing that exists. Similarly, they have attacked us in the past. Therefore, we should know that they're going to do this in the future. This is not something vague. This is something that is happening every day and is a real and existential threat to the West. The next thing that Hewitt tells us is, well, this incentivizes countries to attack soldiers, like gassing them, for example, because that means America might lose appetite for its invasion. I want you to think for a second. If you're a dictatorial regime and America invades in you and you're losing the war, do you think you're going to gas the enemy soldiers anyway, to do anything that you can to try and win the war, to try and not bow to American supremacy? when this occurs, it just means they're still going to gas those soldiers. They're still going to try and do anything that's possible because they've already demonstrated they don't care about human life, that they don't care about their citizens. So there's no reason to believe that this norm would have any additional impact. Importantly, the people we're talking about invading in this debate are just bad actors. They're individuals in which you would not want to see in your domestic country. And when a country can have, the other thing is that Hewitt says there's subjective norms. I agree. Some things are subjective, but they're definitely not vague. It's okay for subjectivism to exist. That's why different countries have different political systems. That's why people vote for different candidates, because they care about different policies. I'm telling you that the calculus should not always include sovereignty of that other nation. And that's the thing I want you to take away from this speech, is that I can make decisions to invade and to not invade using the calculus of the con side, but I do not have to always respect some additional criteria, which is arbitrary in its application. That is the thing that I'm defending.
The reason it's very vague is because every time he gives me a criteria and I give him an analogous situation which meets the criteria, he invents another criteria and says, well, it didn't satisfy this one. And that is what undermines every single criteria he ever gives you. Because if the criteria you use never applies to more than one circumstance, then it's not really a criteria, is it? It's just when we want to invade somewhere, we invent a set of reasons and then we act on them. And what does that tell other nations? What sort of actions does that encourage? Let's look at ISIS as an example. Why was ISIS even created in the first place? Because the power vacuum, which we left in Iraq, because we acted on a complex situation we didn't know anything about, led to the creation of a terrorist cell. Why is it that ISIS is attacking us? Well, their predecessor, the Iraqi government, for example, kept to themselves and didn't attack US citizens. And what did that lead? And what good did it do them? So what does it tell ISIS? It says, well, if we do that, we'll get invaded. We might as well try the other thing. Other countries, for example, which don't have nuclear weapons, like Libya, get steamrolled, right? What does that tell nations like North Korea? If you play by the West rules and you don't get nuclear weapons, you'll get rolled anyway. So you best get nuclear weapons. And that's the problem with these vague standards, right? Is that every time you just shift to another criteria, you tell every other nation that the West is a totally unpredictable actor. And the only way to save yourself is to do crazy shit like terrorism or killing your own citizens or to get nuclear weapons. And no one wants that. And that's why he actually has to comply with one of these analogies for his case to hold any water. And he also has not at all explained any response to my domestic points, right? That when the standards are vague and leaders like Liam can just invent for himself any criteria he wants, it allows, for example, Trump to be like, I'm down in the polls, better invade in Iraq, or better do an untimed, bombing of Syria, because some vague standard has changed, right? And that allows for unjust interventions to occur because the standards are so vague that no leader can ever be held accountable for that decision because there's no criteria for them being checked again, which is why you should support absolute sovereignty.
All right, you're okay with invading a country if the government asks for help, right? Okay. Now, if, for example, the Iraqi government or any government asks for help and then that resulted in ISIS, are you losing this debate?
Well, no, because the fact that they ask for help is exactly what is unlikely to leave a power vacuum. Because when you ask for help, you don't usually displace the government which asked you for help.
All right, but it could be lots of other things. You could not know about the country. You could not know what's going to happen in the future, which is your big claim, that there's uncertainty. That uncertainty exists whether or not the country asks you to do so or not. So literally, all of the harms that Hewitt tells you will apply to his invasions as well. The difference is that his side does not invade in circumstances in which he absolutely should. The thing he tells you in that final speech then was to say, well, I'm constantly changing the criteria. No, there's just lots of criteria. Some circumstances, no, hear me out. Some circumstances, you might invade because there's information and because they're attacking. Some circumstances is because they have an ideological threat and an existential threat. You can mix and match those depending on what is required at the time. And that is okay because, no, stop nodding because this is not a good argument for you because hear me out. All countries do this with every decision. But why? Because most democratic countries are constantly changing their leaders. They're constantly changing their policies, and they're constantly changing the ways in which they're acting. And that's okay, because the world changes around them and they need to update that. His is the side that sticks with the single-minded assessment of intervention, which is absolute sovereignty, which sometimes will just fuck up a country. We know that sometimes we are going to be attacked, and we know that if we don't do this, they are going to attack us anyway. What is the better circumstance, us to go out fighting or to just lay down and cop it?
Obviously, nations can still defend themselves if they're invaded. That's not the burden. But listen to Liam's speech, that they constantly change the criteria. If you can just invent a new reason every time you have a leader change, then that means the only choice for other nations is to get nuclear weapons and defend themselves in the most violent ways possible, because they can never know what the standard for invasion will be. No accountability.
Well, that's obviously bullshit, because I told you in the previous speech that if there's a dictatorial regime, they're going to use nuclear weapons or they're going to use chemical weapons anyway because they're being invaded. This norm doesn't do anything extra. Look, if you're being attacked, you have the right to defend yourself. But importantly, if you think that they're going to attack you in the future, if there's a potential for them to attack, then that is also okay. And that is the thing that Hewitt is avoiding here.